Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine you're trying to help someone learn a new language. Or maybe, you're the one learning.
Mm.
They try to say something, but it comes out, well, not quite right. What do you do right in that moment? Do
Yeah.
you jump in? Do you wait? Maybe just give them the correct answer? Or do you try to explain why it was wrong?
That moment, that
Yeah,
reaction, that's basically what we're diving into today. It's called corrective feedback, or CF for
the
short.
CF. Okay.
And, it sounds simple enough, just fixing an error,
Hmm.
but our source material, mainly this paper by Rod Ellis, it shows it's anything but simple.
Right.
It's actually a huge area of debate in, well, both language teaching, pedagogy, they often call it,
Hmm.
and in second language acquisition, SLA research.
So pedagogy is the teaching side, and SLA is more the research looking at how people actually learn languages. Is that fair?
Exactly, yeah. And what's fascinating right off the bat is this core tension the source highlights.
Hmm.
One expert calls corrective feedback a complicated balancing act.
A balancing act? How so?
Well, you're trying to build a positive, safe space,
Mm-hmm.
where learners feel comfortable taking risks, which is, well, essential for learning.
Sure, you need that.
But correcting someone's mistake is kind of by definition an interactive confrontational activity.
Confrontational.
Yeah, it feels like you're pulling in two different directions.
Support versus accuracy. Okay, okay. Before we dive deeper into that tension, let's just make sure we're all clear. What is corrective feedback, strictly speaking, in this context?
Right. So based on the source, CF is basically any response to something a learner says or writes that contains an error.
Mm-hmm.
And the response is actually aimed at getting them to repair that error. It's not just noticing it, it's doing something about it.
Got it. And these responses, they can look really different, right? Could be just a hint or the right answer or maybe an explanation.
Exactly. All of those. And they can trigger a whole interaction, what the source calls a CF episode.
An episode.
Yeah, like the source gives an example. A learner says, yes, I stand in the first row. The teacher might respond, you stood in the first row.
Ah, giving the past tense.
Right. Then the learner tries again, maybe saying yes in the first row and sat the first row. That last bit where the learner tries to use the correction, that's called uptake.
Uptake.
Ah.
Okay.
But yeah, as you can imagine, these episodes can get way more complicated than just that simple back and forth.
Oh, I can totally see that. You correct one thing, they make a different error trying to fix it, or maybe they just look totally confused.
Precisely. So our mission, really, in this deep dive is to navigate all this complexity. We're going to explore the major disagreements around CF.
Okay, like what?
Well, does it actually help learners acquire the language for good? Or does it just fix the error in that one moment? Which errors should we even focus on? I mean, you can't correct everything.
Right.
Whose job is it anyway? The teacher, the learner, the classmate.
Yeah.
And what's the best way to give the feedback? And maybe the trickiest one, when is the right time to do it? Immediately, later.
Wow, okay. Lots of questions. So we'll see how different teaching ideas and research findings clash on these points.
Yeah. And then we'll try to zoom out a bit, look at the bigger picture, move beyond just sort of the cognitive processing in the learner's head
Mm-hmm.
to think about the social context, the interaction itself, and also the individual learner, their beliefs, their anxieties,
And pull it all together.
hopefully. We'll try to pull out some key guidelines or principles that come out of the research, things to think about for anyone involved in language learning or teaching.
Okay, let's jump into those controversies then, because it really is striking how much people disagree. You've got teachers wondering whether, when, and how to correct.
Yeah, the practical stuff.
While researchers are asking, does it even work long term, and what type of correction is actually most effective? The source makes it super clear. There's no single answer everyone agrees on.
Not at all. And this disagreement really goes back to that balancing act we mentioned. How do you fix errors without making learners shut down or just stopping the flow of conversation? Different approaches have tried to solve that very differently over time.
So historically, it wasn't always seen as a good thing.
Oh, definitely not. Think about some older teaching methods. Audiolingualism, remember drills.
Mm-hmm.
It mostly saw correcting errors, any negative assessment really, as a kind of punishment, something to avoid.
Punishment. Wow.
And then later you had humanistic methods, which really prioritized creating a positive, non-judgmental vibe above all else. So often that meant left error correction to sort of protect the learner's confidence.
Okay, so prioritize feeling good over getting the grammar right.
In those approaches, yeah, you could say that. But then other theories, like skill theory, came along, arguing that learners need that feedback. You need to know you're making a mistake to automate the right way of saying things.
That makes intuitive sense too. And isn't there a more modern view, maybe something teachers use now, that distinguishes between different activities?
Yeah, that's very common. A lot of
Uh,
teachers distinguish between accuracy work, like grammar exercises, where getting it right is the main goal, and CF clearly has a role,
right.
and fluency work, where the focus is just on communicating smoothly, getting your message across. In fluency work, immediate correction might be avoided so you don't interrupt that flow.
Okay, so maybe correct the worksheet right away, but hold back during a group discussion.
That's the kind of practical distinction many teachers make, yeah. But even when correction is used, say in a writing, the evidence on whether it works long-term is, well, it's mixed.
How so?
The source brings up Trescott, who pretty famously argued that correcting errors on a written draft, it helps fix that specific draft, sure.
Makes sense.
But he argued it doesn't actually lead to the learner acquiring the correct form to use next time. It fixes the paper, not the underlying language problem in their head.
That's a bit discouraging if you spend hours marking essays.
It really is.
Yeah.
But of course others, like Dana Ferris, argue against that. They say if written correction is clear, consistent, maybe focused, it can lead to acquisition. The source basically says that the research is complex, hard to generalize, studies do things differently.
Okay. And what about correcting spoken errors? Similar debates there.
Absolutely. Stephen Krashen, a big name in SLA, was famously quite critical of correcting spoken errors in many situations. He called it a serious mistake.
A serious mistake. Why?
He argued it raises the learner's affective filter. Basically, it makes them anxious, defensive.
Ah, the stress barrier.
Exactly, which he believed blocks subconscious language acquisition. For Krashen, acquisition happens naturally through understanding messages, lots of input. Correction, he thought, only helps conscious learning, like memorizing rules, which isn't what fuels real fluency, except maybe for very simple grammar points.
So if I get crashing right,
Yeah.
trying to correct me makes me nervous. And even if I understand the correction intellectually, that knowledge doesn't easily transfer to my spontaneous speech.
That's a good way to put his concern. He felt correction interferes with that natural process. But other major researchers, like Michael Long, have a different take.
Okay, what's the counter argument?
Long suggests that CF, especially when it happens naturally because an error caused a communication breakdown. Someone asks, wait, what did you mean? That process helps learners notice the gap.
Notice the gap.
Yeah, the gap between what they said and what they should have said to be understood correctly. This noticing, Long argues, does help acquisition. It pushes them to pay attention to form.
Okay, so one view, correction blocks acquisition by raising anxiety. Another view, it helps acquisition by promoting noticing. That's a pretty fundamental disagreement.
It really is. But here's a really interesting twist, maybe another layer to the puzzle. What did the learners themselves think about all this?
Oh, right. What did the students want? Do we know?
We do. And it's pretty consistent across studies. Students generally want corrective feedback. They often say they want more correction, especially on grammar.
More, even with the anxiety factor.
Apparently so. And maybe surprisingly, given that confrontational aspect we mentioned, they often prefer the teacher to be the one doing the correcting.
Interesting. Why the teacher specifically?
Well, the source mentions one study, the Zacharias study, that found learners tend to see the teacher's feedback as more accurate, more valid, more trustworthy than, say, getting feedback from a classmate or even trying to figure it out themselves.
Wow, okay. So while the experts are busy debating if it works and if it makes people nervous, the learners themselves are often saying, yes, please, give us more feedback, especially on grammar, and teacher, we trust you to do it. That's quite a disconnect.
It absolutely is, and it's a huge practical challenge for teachers trying to navigate this. If learners want it, and many researchers think it can help, the next big question is, well, which errors should we correct? Because you can't fix everything. It's impossible, and probably not helpful either.
Right, you just overwhelm them. So how do you choose? What are the options?
Well, some early ideas tried to distinguish between errors and mistakes. Errors being the systematic problems showing a real gap in their knowledge.
Things they truly don't know yet.
Exactly. Versus mistakes, which are more like slips of the tongue, performance glitches they could probably fix themselves if they were paying attention. The idea was only correct the true errors.
Okay, that sounds logical, but maybe hard to tell apart in real time.
Very hard. Another idea from Marina Burt was about focusing on global errors over local errors.
Global versus local.
Yeah, global errors are the ones that really mess up the meaning of the whole sentence, like wrong word order. Local errors are smaller things, affecting maybe just a single word ending, like missing the S on a plural noun, that don't usually stop you from understanding the main message.
So fix the big meaning problems first.
That was the suggestion. Krashen, again, suggested focusing on simple, easily explained rules. Ferris, thinking about writing, talked about targeting treatable errors, ones that follow clear patterns. But the source points out, quite rightly, that making these distinctions, error versus mistake, global versus local, simple versus complex, it's really tough to do consistently, especially in a fast-moving conversation. You often just don't know why the learner made that specific slip.
Yeah, I can see that. Was it a one-off mistake, or did they really not understand the past tense? Hard to judge instantly.
It really is. However, there's one aspect of error selection where there seems to be less controversy, actually, and that's about the scope of correction.
Scope, you mean how much you correct at once?
Exactly. Should you try to fix everything you hear or see that's wrong, or should you focus on just one or two things at a time? This is the debate between unfocused and focused CF.
Okay, and what's the general feeling on that?
Most methodologists and researchers lean heavily towards focused CF.
Focused, so pick your battles.
Pretty much. Target one or two specific grammar points, or maybe certain types of vocabulary errors within a particular activity or piece of writing. And there's research evidence, like the Bitchener, Young, and Cameron studies mentioned, suggesting that focused CF actually is more effective for long-term acquisition than just blasting the learner with corrections for every little thing.
That makes sense. Maybe that earlier criticism about written CF not working was because it was often unfocused.
That's definitely a possibility the research suggests. Focus correction might be the key. So, okay, focus seems better than unfocused. Now, the next question, who should actually do the correcting? Is it always the teacher's job?
Yeah, controversy number 3. What are the options here?
Well, learner-centered teaching approaches often emphasize getting the learner involved. So prompting the learner to correct themselves for self-correction, or maybe getting peers involved in giving feedback.
How do you prompt self-correction? Like, what does that look like?
In speaking, it could be the teacher repeating the incorrect part with a questioning intonation, like, you go yesterday, or asking a clarification question like, sorry, what was that? Or, something to signal a problem.
Okay. And in writing?
In writing, it's often called indirect correction. So instead of writing the right answer, the teacher might just underline the error, put a mark in the margin, or maybe use a code like VT for verb tense error. The idea is to push the learner to figure out the correction themselves.
Right, makes them think more. Does it
Yeah.
work? Is prompting self-correction effective for learning?
There is evidence, yeah. Researchers like Leister and Ferris have found that prompting learners to self-correct can be effective for acquisition. It makes them actively retrieve and process the language.
But I sense a but coming.
Yes, there are definitely some buts. First, remember what we said earlier. Learners often prefer the teacher to just tell them the answer.
Yes, the
Yeah.
trust factor.
Right. And second, and this is pretty critical, a learner can only successfully self-correct if they actually know the correct form somewhere in their mental grammar. They can fix a mistake, that slip of the tongue, but they can't fix a true error if they haven't learned the rule or word yet.
Yeah, makes sense. If I genuinely don't know the past tense of go, you asking me go isn't going to magically make me say went. I need the information.
Exactly. For those real gaps in knowledge, teacher input, some form of correction, is often necessary. Plus, some of those prompts, like just saying, or what, they might signal a problem, but they don't necessarily tell the learner it was a linguistic error. Maybe they just thought you didn't hear them or their idea was confusing.
So it can be ambiguous. How do you balance that, trying to get them to self-correct versus knowing when to just provide the fix?
The source mentions a kind of two-stage solution that's sometimes proposed. Stage 1, try to elicit self-correction. Use a prompt. If the learner struggles or can't do it.
Then move to stage 2.
Right. Stage 2, provide the correction yourself. The example given is a teacher repeating ulners. I think that the worm will go into the soil, trying to
Right.
get past tense. Learner doesn't get it. Teacher eventually provides, you thought that the worm would go into the soil.
I see. Start subtle, get more direct if needed.
Yeah, but the source also notes, realistically, that this two-stage process can be pretty time-consuming in a classroom compared to a quick, direct correction like, you need past tense here thought.
Time is always precious in class. Okay, so who corrects is tangled up with how they correct, which brings us neatly to controversy number 4. What's the best strategy for giving feedback?
This is a huge one because the menu of options is so long. For written CF, like we said, a big debate is direct correction, giving the answer, versus indirect correction, indicating the error.
Mm-hmm.
For oral CF, there are key distinctions like explicit versus implicit feedback. Explicit means clearly pointing out the error. No, not good, it's went. Implicit is more subtle, like a recast.
Okay, explicit versus implicit. And there was another one.
Input providing versus output prompting. Input providing means the teacher gives the correct form, like in a recast or explicit correction. Output prompting means trying to get the learner to produce the correct form, like asking, how do we say that in the past?
Got it. The source lists a whole bunch of specific strategies, doesn't it? A taxonomy.
It does. Beyond just explicit correction, you've got things like metalinguistic explanation actually explaining the grammar rule involved.
You need past tense because.
Exactly. Then elicitation, trying to draw the correct form out of the learner. Paralinguistic signals,
Mm.
gestures, facial expressions, repetition, just repeating the learner's error, maybe with emphasis, clarification requests, sorry, what do you mean? And then recasts.
Recasts seemed really important and kind of complex in the description.
They are, and they've been studied a lot. A recast is essentially when the teacher repeats the learner's incorrect sentence, but fixes the error, usually while keeping the conversation going.
Can you give an example again?
Sure. Learner says, I go park yesterday. Teacher might reply smoothly, oh, you went to the park yesterday. Was it fun?
Ah, okay. You just slipped the correction in there without making a big deal of it.
That's the idea.
Mm.
But the source stresses that recasts themselves are really varied. They can have different intonation. Some sound like corrections. Some just sound like confirming understanding. They might correct just the single error word or rephrase the whole sentence. They can be short or long. How noticeable or effective a recast is really depends on how it's delivered and the context.
And the source also mentioned something interesting about teachers maybe not always being perfectly precise or consistent.
Yes, that's a fascinating point. Imprecision might mean a teacher uses the same signal, like repetition, for different purposes at different times. Sometimes it's a correction prompt. Sometimes it's just checking comprehension.
Okay.
And inconsistency means correcting, say, a past tense error for student A, but letting the exact same error go uncorrected when student B says it moments later.
That sounds like, well, potentially confusing or unfair teaching.
It does seem that way on the surface. But the source offers a different interpretation. It suggests that imprecision might actually force learners to think harder, to process the feedback more deeply, to figure out the teacher's intention.
Huh. Makes them work for it.
Maybe. And inconsistency, as one researcher, suggested way back, might not just be random. It might actually be skilled teachers adapting their feedback implicitly, based on their perception of each individual student's needs, current focus, or even personality in that moment.
Wow. So inconsistency could actually be a sign of responsive, differentiated teaching, not just carelessness. That really flips the usual thinking.
It does. And because of all this complexity, the different strategies, the potential for ambiguity, the role of context teacher educators have generally been pretty reluctant to say this strategy is best. They tend to focus more on making teachers aware of the options and the complexities involved.
But what about the SLA researchers? Did they have stronger opinions on which strategies are better?
Oh, they definitely have preferences, but guess what? They disagree with each other too.
Of course they do.
So Long, who valued keeping communication flowing, was a big fan of recasts because they provide correct input without really interrupting. Seedhouse, looking closely at classroom talk, argued for more direct, explicit repair because it's less ambiguous and potentially less face-threatening than a subtle recast the learner might miss.
Okay.
And then Leister, who really emphasizes the importance of learner output, favors those output prompting strategies, like elicitation. He thinks making the learner produce the correct form helps them gain better control over language they're still learning.
So input versus clarity versus output. Different priorities lead to different preferred strategies.
Exactly. So what does the overall body of SLA research tell us? Well, the big meta-analysis mentioned in the source confirms that CF in general does seem to be effective for acquisition. It helps.
Okay, so correction does work. That's important.
It seems so. But figuring out which specific strategy is definitively the best is really difficult because studies are designed so differently. However, one traditional review did suggest that both implicit and explicit types of CF are beneficial, but that explicit feedback is, on average, slightly more effective than implicit feedback.
Slightly more effective. Sounds like there's still a major caveat.
Always. The source hammers home the point. No single strategy is likely to be the best for all learners. Learning all types of language features in all kinds of situations, it always comes back to context and the individual.
Which feels like a good lead-in to the final controversy. When should the correction happen? Timing.
Right, for written feedback, it's pretty much always delayed. You hand in the paper, you get it back later.
True.
But for spoken language, teachers face that immediate choice. Do I correct right now the instant I hear the error? Or do I wait, delay the feedback until later, maybe after the activity or even next lesson?
And the common practice often links back to that accuracy versus fluency idea we talked about earlier, doesn't it?
It often does. The typical advice is often correct immediately during accuracy-focused activities, like a grammar drill. But delay correction during fluency-focused activities, like a debate or role play, to avoid disrupting the flow.
And what techniques are used for delayed correction?
Teachers might jot down errors they hear during a conversation and then review them with the class afterwards, or perhaps record learners speaking and analyze the errors later, maybe even one-on-one.
But there's a strong case made for immediate correction too, right? Based on how learning happens.
There is. Catherine Dowdy, for instance, argues that immediate CF is crucial because it happens within a specific window of opportunity.
Window of opportunity.
Yeah, the idea is that at the moment the learner makes the error, their primary focus is on conveying meaning, but their attention can be briefly shifted to the language form if the feedback comes right then. She argues that delayed feedback coming later when the context is gone is much less likely to impact their underlying implicit knowledge system. It might only contribute to conscious rule learning.
Okay, so immediate feedback hits when the iron is hot, cognitively speaking.
That's the essence of the argument. And notice, this view directly clashes with those teacher educators who advise delaying feedback specifically during fluency work to protect that focus on meaning and flow. It's another head-on conflict in recommendations.
So who wins? Is immediate better? Is delayed better? What does the evidence say overall?
According to the source, there's actually no general consensus or really strong conclusive evidence showing that immediate correction is definitively superior to delayed correction across the board, or vice versa. It seems to be another area where the best approach likely depends on the specific context, the type of error, the activity, and the learner.
Wow, okay. So across the board, whether it helps, which errors to pick, who should correct, how they should do it, and when there are just layers upon layers of debate and complexity, it's really clear that fixing an error isn't just a simple mechanical act.
Absolutely not. And that leads the source to argue strongly for needing a much broader perspective than just looking at correction strategies in isolation.
Broader.
We can't just look at the cognitive side, how the brain processes the feedback. We have to consider the social dimension, the classroom context, the relationship between the teacher and learner, their cultural backgrounds, and the psychological dimension too. The learner's own beliefs about errors and correction, their aptitude for language, their anxiety levels. A truly effective approach needs to integrate all three: cognitive, social, and psychological.
So it's not just about the grammar rule or the mental process. It's deeply about the people involved and the entire situation.
Precisely. And the source suggests that sociocultural theory, often called SCT, provides a really useful framework for bringing these different dimensions together.
Okay, SCT. What's the core idea there regarding language learning?
SCT, drawing heavily on Vygotsky's work, sees learning, including language learning, as fundamentally social. It doesn't just happen inside the learner's head, it originates in social interaction.
Learning happens between people first.
In a sense, yes. Interaction is where learners get pushed, where they get support, where learning happens. It reveals what a learner can do with help, that's their potential. And this potential unfolds in what Vygotsky called the zone of proximal development, or ZPD.
The ZPD, I've heard that term. That's the gap between what you can do alone and what you can do with help.
Exactly that sweet spot where learning is possible with the right kind of assistance or scaffolding from someone more knowledgeable, a teacher, a peer, even a parent. And learning, in this view, is essentially a process of moving from needing that external help, other regulation, to being able to manage it yourself, self-regulation.
Okay, so how does corrective feedback fit into this SCT picture? Is it seen as that scaffolding?
Yes, precisely. CF is viewed as one important form of assistance within the ZPD, helping the learner bridge that gap. So this perspective leads to some distinct principles for how we should think about CF.
All right, let's hear the SCT principles for correction.
Okay, first, CF should be seen as a collaborative effort. It's not the teacher imposing something, but teacher and learner working together towards shared understanding and goals.
Collaborative, got it.
Second, correction should only happen when there's a real need for assistance. If the learner could have self-corrected, maybe the help wasn't necessary right then. Third, and this is crucial in SET, CF must be highly flexible and dialogic. It has to be adapted constantly to the individual learner and the specific context of the interaction. SET strongly rejects any one-size-fits-all approach.
Flexibility again, it keeps coming up. Because every learner, every moment is unique.
Absolutely. Fourth, effective CF is seen as helping the participants interactively construct a ZPD for that particular language point, for that learner, right there and then. Fifth, the assistance provided should be graduated.
Graduated.
Meaning you provide only the minimal level of help needed for the learner to succeed in fixing the error. You might start with a very implicit hint and only become more explicit if the learner needs more support. It's about offering the right amount of help, not too much, not too little.
That sounds a bit like that two-stage idea, but maybe more fluid.
Exactly. Much more dynamic and moment to moment, guided by the learner's response. Sixth, and this ties back to the balancing act, SCT emphasizes that CF must consider the learner's affective state, their feelings, anxiety, motivation. The assistance has to be offered in a way that's supportive and doesn't shut down participation.
The human element is central.
Very much so. Seventh, echoing what we've seen elsewhere, no single strategy, like recasts or explicit correction, is considered inherently better than another. Its effectiveness depends entirely on whether it's appropriate for that learner in that ZBD at that moment.
Context is king.
Pretty much. Eighth, learner uptake when the learner tries to use the correction is seen as beneficial. It's a visible step towards self-regulation. But the teacher doesn't necessarily have to force the learner to produce the correct form immediately if they aren't ready. Providing the opportunity for uptake is key.
So uptake is good, a positive sign, but not something to be demanded.
That seems to be the SCP view. And ninth, perhaps the most fundamental point from an SCT perspective. Ultimately, it's the learner who actively chooses whether or not to internalize the feedback, to appropriate it and make it part of their own linguistic system. The teacher can guide, mediate, support, but the learning itself is done by the learner.
This really reframes CF, doesn't it? It's not just the teacher spotting an error and fixing it. It's this dynamic, skilled interaction aimed at helping the learner develop the ability to eventually monitor and fix their own errors.
Exactly. It makes the teacher's role incredibly complex, requiring constant observation, sensitivity, and judgment. The source mentions a classic study by Al-Jafrey and Lantolf, where they showed how a writing tutor gradually reduced the explicitness of their feedback over time as the learners became more capable, demonstrating that ZPD-sensitive, graduated assistance in action.
Okay, so after wading through all these debates and considering this SCT framework, what are the practical takeaways? The source wraps up by offering some guidelines or propositions for teachers based on synthesizing all this.
Right, and these aren't meant as rigid rules, more as points for reflection for teachers to consider and maybe debate in their own context.
Let's hear them.
Okay, first, CF generally works. The research overall suggests it's beneficial for acquisition. So the message is, don't be afraid to correct, even perhaps thoughtfully, during fluency activities.
That definitely pushes back against the strict no correction in fluency time rule.
It does. Second, talk to your students about CF. Find out their attitudes, their preferences. Explain why you correct and what the potential benefits are. Try to negotiate goals together. This respects that learner desire we discussed.
Make it transparent and collaborative.
Exactly. Third, use focused CF. Target specific language points you're working on rather than everything at once. And, crucially, make sure learners notice the feedback, ensure it's salient enough for them to realize they're being corrected.
Clear, targeted, and noticeable. Makes sense.
Fourth, develop a repertoire of CF strategies. Be able to use variety and adapt your approach to the learner and the situation. Maybe start implicitly, but be ready to get more explicit if needed. Flexibility is key.
Have different tools in the toolbox.
Right. Fifth, experiment with both immediate and delayed CF timing. Since the research isn't conclusive on which is always better, try different approaches depending on the activity, the error, the learner, and see what seems most effective in your classroom.
Be open to both timings, despite the debates. Interesting.
Sixth, allow learners opportunity for uptake. Give them a chance to respond to the correction and try to use it, as this can help internalization. But again, don't feel you have to force them to produce the correct form if they seem unable or unwilling in that moment.
Provide the space, but don't compel performance.
Good way to put it. Seventh, be prepared to vary your approach based on individual learners. Who you correct, when you correct them, How you correct them might differ from student to student. Yes, this means being prepared to be technically inconsistent.
But inconsistent in a principled, responsive way.
Exactly. Inconsistency is adaptation, not just randomness. Eighth, don't be surprised if you have to correct the same error multiple times for the same learner. Learning isn't instant. Mastering complex forms takes repeated attention and practice, often prompted by recurring feedback.
Patience and persistence are needed.
And ninth, actively work to help learners manage any anxiety associated with being corrected. Frame errors as normal, expected parts of learning, and feedback as help, not criticism. Scaffold their responses.
These guidelines really paint a picture of corrective feedback as a highly skilled, incredibly dynamic, and deeply learner-sensitive aspect of teaching. It's so much more than just marking things right or wrong.
It really shifts the focus from simply achieving surface accuracy in the moment to fostering the learner's long-term development towards autonomy and self-regulation.
So pulling back for a final thought here, we started this deep dive thinking about, just fixing a word or a grammar mistake. And we've ended up seeing corrective feedback as this incredibly complex interplay of cognition, how our brains process language, social interaction, and individual psychology.
Yeah, and we've seen just how much disagreement there is among the experts on nearly every single aspect. Does it work? Which errors? Who corrects? How? When? There really are no easy universal answers coming straight from the research.
But that research, and especially the theory like SCT, it doesn't leave us empty-handed. It steers us away from searching for that single magic bullet strategy. Instead, it points towards viewing CF as this dynamic, flexible, collaborative process. Something that needs to be finely tuned to the individual learner, their needs, and that specific learning moment.
It's about providing the right kind of scaffolding at the right time to help that learner take the next step towards being able to manage it themselves. It's guided growth, not just error stamping.
Yeah. This deep dive really highlights how something that might seem like a simple, everyday classroom technique is actually this incredibly rich, complex area of study and practice, with really profound implications for how we effectively help people master a new language.
And it underscores what a demanding, skillful effective correction really is, both for the teacher delivering it and maybe even for the learner receiving and using it well.
Absolutely. So let's leave our listeners with this provocative thought to mull over. We know from the research that learners, by and large, want correction. They ask for it. Yet we've also seen just how complex and potentially fraught doing it effectively actually is, balancing accuracy and support, getting the timing and strategy right for each person. So how can we, in practice, bridge that gap between the strong learner desire for feedback and the sheer expert complexity of providing it well? How can we make those moments of correction feel less like judgment, more like genuine moments of connection, support, and ultimately growth?